Hi, I'm Isel Dobell for Where Do We Stand, a group of hundreds of citizens in North Cowichan advocating for active conservation of our community forest, known locally as the Six Mountains. With us today is Wade Davis. Wade is a renowned ethnobotanist, author of 20 books advocating for endangered ecosystems, rivers, forests, plants, and people around the world. Wade is a member of the Order of Canada and for 14 years was an explorer in residence for National Geographic, and the list goes on. Thank you, Wade, for joining us.
My pleasure, Isel.
Wade, as an ethnobotanist who's traveled the world for us, what is it you would say about our Six Mountain forests that are, what is it that's so important to protect going forward?
Well, I think the real issue here is the kind of clash of cultures that this conflict represents. My credential to speak about this is less my academic training in anthropology or ethnobotany, but the fact that I worked as a logger in the bush for many seasons and a full year as an engineer for Mac Blow on Haida Gwaii in the 1970s. And the two things I came away from that experience, well, first of all, there wasn't a single decision made by our team that took into account any ecological parameter whatsoever. And the second lesson, I suppose, was that the men and women in the camp fighting off hunger with a chainsaw weren't the enemy. And the third thing was a realization that the only way we could possibly have been doing what we were doing to those magnificent old growth forests, men cutting down in minutes trees that had taken thousands of years to grow, was to have a completely different view of the forest. And this gets us to the whole kind of almost ideology of scientific forestry. People of my father's generation, grew up believing that a resource left in the ground was something wasted, that the trees left to fall to rot in the forest were somehow a wasted opportunity economically. And in fact, the whole language of scientific forestry suggests less kind of a science than a way of thinking about the forest. The language itself is almost disingenuous, as if conceived to deceive. For example, for years, foresters have spoken of the working forest, which really is a euphemism for the forest that is subject to the saw. Forests work on their own, I suppose, in a biological sense, and always have. But again, we talk of harvesting timber that was never planted. We talk about forests being decadent and overmature when they're at their greatest biological extent. The entire notion of sustained yield was predicated on the idea that we would transform the old growth into tree farms and have a higher rate of increment of cellulose. Multiple use forestry which is supposed to mean using the forest for multiple uses, it begins with a clear cut. And so the entire industry is predicated on this assumption that the forest exists to be cut. And I think what we're seeing in Cowichan is simply a shift in values, where people are saying, no, that's not what the forest is all about. That's not the only purpose to have a forest. The forests, in fact, are the shelters of our lives. The forests, in fact, reveal miracles that were inconceivable and would have been ridiculed not 20 years ago when I worked, or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whenever it was, in the logging camp. If I had told a forester back then that trees literally communicate with each other through chemicals in the same sense that we communicate through language, I would have been laughed out of that camp. But in fact, that's exactly what Suzanne Simard's research at UBC has revealed in a rather astonishing way. If I had said to the men in the bush that every time they set a cork boot on the ground, they were stepping on 600 miles of mycelial filaments that are the interconnective tissue that allows these forests to exist, the very matrix that life is based on. If I were to remind foresters back in the 1970s that these forests only exist because they're remnants of the coniferous forests that once covered the planet until the flowering plants evolved a mechanism of fertilization that swept the conifers from the stage of the earth, such that only on this coast of British Columbia do these ancient forests still remain. How rare they are. And that's only because we have hot, dry summers and cold, wet winters and the deciduous angiosperms or flowering plants have not really been able to displace the conifers as they have been displaced in every corner of the world, particularly in the hotbed of evolution in the tropics. And so we're talking about forests here that are extraordinarily rare in history on Earth, and within Canada. And yet we still
Wade,
have,
I just wanted to make sure, I know you're talking about the whole picture, and I know you realize that our forests in North Cowichan are not old growth, they're 70-year-old
yeah,
naturally, right?
but
So
but the thing is, second, I mean, one of the great things about this coast, ISIL, is how incredibly resilient it is, which is our great hope. And the second growth forests on the six mountains that you're working to defend, just because they represent a second flush of life in the wake of the destruction caused by industrial forestry, doesn't mean they're somehow depauperate or in any way a shadow of the other forests. It's sort of silly to think in those terms. You know, the secondary forests here on Bowen Island, where I live, are extraordinarily rich. And one of the great things, if you go up to Haida Gwaii, for example, and see some of the sites that were ravaged in the 70s, it's reassuring to see the extent to which they've greened up. Now, that doesn't mean the whole range of biodiversity is returned by any means, but it does mean that this is a dynamic, living forest in a dynamic region. 10,000 years ago, it was covered by ice. The red cedar tree only marched up the coast around 5,000 years ago. So these are dynamic, growing. So I sometimes think that dichotomy between old growth and mature second growth is a bit almost artificial, because it implies somehow the secondary forest is perhaps less important simply because it is a forest that has grown historically in the lifetime, say, of our grandparents and our parents and ourselves. But these forests for the children of Cowichan are not remnants. They are what the kids have known and the places where they can find their lives. And so
Wade, could you go on about this? That, a lot of people think, when they think of second growth forests, they think of tree plantations. And many people in North Cowichan don't realize that our forests on the valley side of the mountains, the backside have been overlogged. We can't log back there for years. But on the valley side, we have 70-year-old, mature, naturally regenerated versus tree plantations. A lot of people don't know the difference between the two. And
well, in most of British Columbia, certainly on the easy to reach sites on places like Vancouver Island or Bowen Island for that matter, which was cleared off at the turn of the 20th century, there were no plans to replant anything. Even in the 1970s, when I worked at Dean and Bay on Graham Island of Haida Gwaii, in the tens of thousands of acres that we leveled, maybe a handful had little yellow signs saying that they had been restocked. I mean, it just wasn't done. There was a strong sense then that natural regeneration was as effective or more effective than tree planting. Well, of course, the tree planting has come on big in recent years, in part because it's a political gesture that makes the forestry sector look better. In other words, people want to believe these trees are replanted, whereas a lot of foresters will confess that natural regen in many places is as effective. But the bottom line is that the separation of old growth versus secondary forests, it's kind of a sleight of hand that somehow sends a message that these regenerated forests are either not real forests, or that they're not as important, they're not worthy of protection, because after all, they've already been cut once. And that would be a misreading of both the ecology and the history of the coast, because of course, at one point, 10,000 years ago, this was all covered by ice. And what we call the old growth forests were just forests that grew up on their own in the same way that regenerated forests grew up on their own in cutover sites in British Columbia. So, the real issue is whether or not we're going to allow communities and families like yourselves to have a voice in the policy. This is really what's going on Six Mountains. For years, the forestry sector has dominated the discourse in the province, even as values have shifted for most of British Columbians. And they persist in this sort of idea that is a working forest and that they have the right to it. Any section of it that is cut out of the overall acreage of industrialized forest is somehow something being given to the province by the benevolence of the companies. And I think that's kind of a mixed set of priorities. And I think when a group of a community, families, children, parents, teachers like yourselves stand up, it's something bigger than protecting this particular stand of timber.
Wait,
Over
can I just add here for viewers who don't realize this? A lot of people in 4 years ago, when it was discovered that logging was coming over the backs of the mountains, almost no one in North Cowichan realized that we own the forest to protect as a community, and I include the Quetzin in the community, of course. So then what wasn't realized is that we, our own community, not only do we own them, we are logging them ourselves. We hire 2 companies from outside of North Cowichan to log them. And it's not a lot of logging, but it's 2% a year, and over 50 years, well, it's all gone, of course, 100% is gone. So when you consider that the backs of the mountains are all gone, so 50% is gone, and we log at 2%, well, do the math. But anyway, I think it's really important people realize this is not like any other community forest that is owned by the Crown in the province, and it's not like any forest on the continent. We are the only community on the continent with this many forests to protect.
Well, then you've got people in your community who are obviously perpetuating this idea that forests exist to be cut.
I feel, what we've noticed this 4 years, what's exciting is that, people are, this is a consultation, a public consultation ongoing for 4 years. So we're all learning. And I feel that we're coming together as a community. Or we do. I mean, thousands of people, in this last week, we've been reaching out. Our public consultation, has been ongoing and will be ongoing. But, this last week, there were 10,000 views of, information going back and forth in our community. So,
well, but this is what I think is exciting about it. And this is how democracy works. And this is how values that change through time become incorporated into policy. And then we take them for granted. And this goes across the society. I mean, no one could have guessed in my youth that gay men and women would be free to marry. It would have been inconceivable. No one could have guessed that people of color would go from the woodshed to the White House. No one, at a time when just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. No one could have anticipated a kind of global environmental movement focused on a dire threat to all of humanity and climate change. So part of what this is all about is an ongoing dialogue, which is the basis of democracy. But again, we have to break through, I think, in general in British Columbia and even in your locale, this notion that these forests exist to be cut. I mean, we recently on Bowen Island here, suddenly out of the blue, we discovered, that we're in the Fraser Valley Timber Supply Unit, and some bureaucrat up in Chilliwack had arbitrarily assigned clear-cut logging to a third of Bowen Island. Of course, people here would never let that happen, but the very fact that it even come out as part of a provincial agenda just seemed absolutely almost Kafkaesque. But again, these people are sitting there looking at maps. They've got volumes of timber to produce. I mean, there is a lot of kind of almost hypocrisy involved. I mean, you have the city of Vancouver making great fanfare of going to zero carbon emissions by 2030 in a province that allows the production of 65 million cubic meters of timber every year, when forests are in fact our best carbon sinks. So, what you're involved in, I support you and admire the effort, this is the real stuff of democracy. It's local people standing up, dealing with local issues and confronting authorities. And it's not always easy or comfortable to do. And you can subject yourself to ridicule. You can subject yourself to any number of assaults on social media and so on, but people do this because they care. And if we didn't have people standing up because they care, we would have lost a lot of our heritage.
Wade, I'm so grateful for your time. On that note, I just want to give some credit and thanks to various community groups in the province, advocacy groups that don't have the power we have and are watching our community. And I've actually, a couple came and spoke to our community, and they are facing flooding and fires because of tree plantations that are susceptible to fire, as opposed to older bark thick trees, et cetera. So I'd like to thank right now, all of the communities that are reaching out to us and encouraging us to keep going, and hopefully all the communities in British Columbia will come together as one voice. Thank you.
You bet. My pleasure.